summer of 1858, when the river smelled like iron and thunder, a smokehouse on the glass plantation burned from the inside out, slow, deliberate, as if the fire had been taught its letters and told to spell one name. Lydia. If you're listening in a dark room right now, do one thing for me. Subscribe to Tales Never Told, ring that bell, and drop where you're watching from. Because what we're about to open was nailed shut for a reason. They called her Little Lydia like smallness could protect anyone. 12. Maybe 13. Quick with her hands. Quicker with a tune she hummed under her breath while scraping salt from pork rinds. A red calico ribbon kept her hair out of the smoke. Someone had given it to her and no one ever said who. The mistress claimed it came from a worn-out dress. The quarters said it came from a grave. The overseer said nothing, but the first time he tried to take it, he left with 3 parallel scratches under his wrist and a superstition he never admitted to. The smokehouse sat 50 steps from the big kitchen, a low brick cube with a clay roof and a door swollen with years of grease and August air. Inside, meat hung like mute bells, hams, shoulders, links braided neat by hands that did not own them. The brine barrel had a hoop missing. The ledger nail by the door held the week's chalk. Salt, 8 scoops. Hickory, 3 bundles. Lydia, 5 days. The misspelling wasn't an accident. On plantations, wrong letters are a leash. The fire started just after midnight, the time of mules' ears twitching and babies' lungs choosing between sleep and crying. It didn't roar, it breathed. A soft sound, like someone trying to blow out a candle from far away and failing. By the time anyone smelled it, the smokehouse was lit from its own belly, glowing red through chinks, the door huffing resinous breath. They found the door barred from the outside. They tore it open with a fence post. Smoke wrote every secret it had kept straight into their eyes. The first thing the light touched was the brine barrel, half-boiled, its scum quivering like something alive deciding not to be. Hook swayed. Some meat had fallen, some had blackened, some were simply gone without dripping to prove it. And the floor, packed dirt that had taken years of sweat to beat into hardness, showed 3 things as plain as scripture: Lydia's small bare footprints, a second set beside them that didn't look like boots, and a smear where both sets stopped at the wall. No body. No bones. No ribbon. Master Harlan Glass stood in the doorway with his nightshirt unbuttoned to his chest, and a face that looked like it had made a deal with something and was now renegotiating. Accident, he said, as if the word could march back into the house and tuck the night away. A grease flare. She ran. She'll turn up. Back to bed. But accident is a little word, and the river was wide. In the morning, the kitchen girls found salt prints on the steps. White crystals laid down like a constellation somebody had drawn wrong. The prints turned at the pump and then vanished 5 feet before the yard's edge, as if the feet had learned another way to walk. By noon, the brine had cooled to a white skim like the top of old milk. Dinah in the quarters. Yes, another Dinah, but don't mix her with the one from other stories. Pain makes names multiply. Said she'd heard Hickory popping all night like bones counting themselves. Old Aunt Saffron, the swamp woman people hired to cure fevers they insisted were air, showed up uninvited and stood with her hand against the smokehouse wall the way you touch a sick horse. Still warm, she whispered. Not from fire. From forgetting. Mistress Temperance Glass, who wore mourning black for a sister she had outlived, ordered the men to scrape every inch of soot, to scrub the hooks, to boil the shackles they used to haul hogs. We will not feed evil, she said, and there was a tremor in her somewhere between fear and pride. At dusk, when the sun sank like a copper coin and the mosquitoes tuned their thin violins, Joshua, the runner boy whose feet could outrun most lies, came to Miss Lottie with a palm full of something he'd picked from the ash pile behind the smokehouse. Was stuck in there like it didn't want to be seen, he said. In his hand lay 3 narrow threads of red calico twisted into a knot, and something else, a bead of hardened sap, brown and clear, with a single black hair embalmed in it like a curse you could hold up to the light. They took it to the quarters, because secrets go there first. Aunt Saffron rolled the calico threads between her fingers until they clicked like little bones. Not burnt, she said. Just kissed. She touched the sap bead to her tongue and made a face like someone had said a bad word in a church. Pitch, she muttered. Fresh. Not from hickory. From the river pines. Only fools, the brave, and the truly damned go into the river pines after dark. That night the smokehouse exhaled one last breath, cold this time, and the door that had always stuck swung open as easy as an apology. On the inside of the plank, written with a nub of chalk on greasy wood, were 4 letters, shaky, tall, and bent to the right like a girl's hand had reached high, Lydy. The last A was missing. Or waiting. Here is what the old people said, quiet, like teeth talking to each other. Lydia had been seen the week before with a bundle under her arm and her eyes not on the ground but on the tree line. A man none of them recognized had been seen too, a peddler, maybe, with a cart that jingled without wind. He had told Mistress Temperance she needed needles and told the overseer his horse was tired and told Lydia nothing anyone heard. But after he left, the smokehouse ledger changed, from Lydia, 4 days to Lydia, 5 days, and no one admitted to touching the chalk. And the second set of tracks? The ones beside Lydia's bare prints? Joshua traced them with his fingertip from the door to the wall, careful, reverent, the way a child touches a name on a tomb. Not boots, not shoes, toes long and narrow like a hand had learned to walk and then forgot halfway. When the moon rose, high and mean, the river threw a band of light through the cane and it lay across the yard like a path you could step on if you trusted water. Mercy, the good mare, isn't in this tale. That was another county, another reckoning. Here there was only the glass mule, Tabber, who refused to drink from the trough for the first time in his sad, obedient life. He kept his head turned toward the pines and breathed like he'd smelled something coming that had no right to a smell. By midnight, the quarters heard humming, the tune Lydia used to keep time with her scraping, coming thin through the cane. Not from the smokehouse. From the river pines. Low. Patient. As if the voice was under something heavy and not worried about running out of air. The men went to fetch their courage. The women went to fetch the children's hands. Aunt Saffron picked up her bag. Mistress Temperance laced her boots and lifted her skirts like a woman walking into church to tell God he'd miscounted. And Master Harlan Glass, who had watched fortunes made and bodies broken and believed both were the same currency, loaded a pistol, checked the powder with his thumb, and told himself a thing that only sounds wise if you've never had to say it in a mirror: she can be recovered. The humming stopped. A wind came, but it came from under the ground. Someone, no one agrees who, stepped into the first rank of trees, held up the calico threads, and said the oldest question, "Lydia? You there, baby?" Something answered. Not in words. In temperature. In the way the gnats dropped all at once as if a sheet had been pulled over their heads. In the way the pines leaned, just a little, like a person listening hard. In the way the river gave one soft slap against the bank and then went perfectly still. By morning, the smokehouse door had a new mark on the inside, faint, low, like it had been scratched by someone short, a little curve where an A might start. Morning carved the fog into ribbons, and the river pines stood like jurors who had already decided. Aunt Saffron brought out a blue bottle with a dead bee sealed inside, her listening jar. She set it on the smokehouse threshold, and the glass fogged from the inside as if something were breathing back. She ain't gone far, Aunt Saffron said, but far ain't measured in steps. Mistress Temperance knelt where the salt prints had vanished and sprinkled fresh grains in a tight ring. The crystals jumped. Yes, jumped, like a skillet popping. "Ground's restless," Joshua whispered. He pointed to the inside wall, to the half-born A. She's trying to finish a word. They formed a line at the cane break, Harlan Glass with his pistol, Temperance with a shawl and a jaw you don't argue with, Joshua carrying a coil of line, Miss Lottie with a lantern too clean for night work, and Aunt Saffron with a sack of 9 bent nails, a twist of hair, and river clay. A bell chimed beyond the trees. Not a church bell. A cart bell, thin and satisfied. The peddler? The path into the pines was not a path so much as a suggestion, the floor needled with brown, the air smelling like turpentine and honey gone wrong. Every 20 paces, Aunt Saffron stopped and pressed pitch to her tongue, reading bitterness like scripture. Fresh tapping, she muttered. Not man's hand. They reached a cypress knee taller than Joshua. Red calico snagged there, 3 threads the exact shade of an old wound. Beneath the knee, a thumbprint in pitch. Too long to be a man's, too human to be a beast's. Temperance stiffened. What is it? Miss Lottie asked. Account keeping, Aunt Saffron said, and dropped the first of her bent nails into the pitch. It hissed like a name you're not supposed to say. The humming rose again, Lydia's tune, but braided now with something slower, like a bass note underwater. Joshua held the lantern low. A rude glyph had been smeared in resin on the bark, for tall marks and a hooked flourish. Not letters, not ours, but they made the eye itch the way false ledgers do. Harland lifted the pistol toward the dark. Come out, he said to nothing. Return the girl. He sounded like a man bargaining with a mirror. The bell rang once more and was still. Something out there had a schedule. Back, Aunt Saffron ordered. We ain't paid yet. She knelt and drew a circle of salt around the cypress knee, leaving a gap no wider than a child's foot. Into that gap she set her bee in a bottle. The glass fogged, then cleared. Fogged, then cleared. She's breathing, Aunt Saffron said, eyes going wet. But the air ain't from here. Behind them, the smokehouse door, 50 steps away and out of sight, made a sound which shouldn't make when there's no wind, a quiet, pleased click. A ledger being opened. Stories on the glass place grew like canes, tall, crowded, full of knives. You should know what Lydia carried before the fire. She had a way of counting you without moving her lips, eyes at your hands, your shoulder, your shoes, like she was adding you up on a slate inside her skull. She belonged to Mistress Temperance's portion of the estate on paper, which is another way to say she belonged to whoever needed the thing she was good at: salt, smoke, and making old meat last through hot months. People trusted her with time, and that is the most dangerous trust. The ribbon. Temperance swore it had come from her sister's scrap chest. Household cloth, nothing more. But Miss Lottie had seen Temperance cut that ribbon at a graveside when she was 16, humming steady so the sob in her throat didn't get out and embarrass the family. The grave was for a baby who had breathed for 11 minutes and held a finger. After that, Temperance stopped standing near cradles. Years later, the ribbon resurfaced in a rag bundle with a faint smell of rose and ashes. When Lydia tied it in her hair, no one told her whose breath had once warmed it. A month before the fire, the peddler came sweating up the drive with a cart of needles and mirrors and tin hearts that clinked like polite threats. He had eyes the color of the river when it's thinking of rising. He said, smooth, sir smoother, and little one like a price. He stayed long enough to fix a broken hinge on the smokehouse and to drink a glass of buttermilk while Harlan signed a paper no one else read. Just a guarantee, the peddler had smiled, tapping the cart bells with a fingernail so they sang together. Debts get nervous if you don't name them. When he left, the ledger nailed by the smokehouse door carried a new chalk mark no hand admitted writing. Lydia, 5 days. The overseer, Graves, who spelled his own name wrong because a teacher had once corrected him with a ruler, told the quarters that if a girl ran, they'd hang the ribbon on the big house porch to lure her back. That's how you talk to birds. That week, 2 hens laid blood-specked eggs, and Tabber the mule kept his head low like prayers were heavy. At supper on Sunday, Temperance cut her meat in exact squares and ate none of it. Miss Lottie watched her count bites for a plate she didn't taste. Say it, Lottie breathed when the men got loud in the study. Temperance stared at her untouched fork. I took a quieting to a man once, she said at last, voice thin. He had pine pitch on his cuffs and a bell that never rusted. He told me grief could be catalogued like silverware. He told me if I gave him a name to take the edge off God for 1 hour, he'd give it back sweeter. I was 17. I said the first name that came to mind. It wasn't mine. Lydia hummed in the yard, and the sound made Temperance's fork shake. Lottie set her hand over Temperance's knuckles until the tremor passed. There are bargains you can break by speaking them. There are others that harden when the words hit air. Temperance swallowed what wanted out and stood to clear the plates. In the kitchen, the salt barrel had sweated. Crystals caked the hoop and spelled, if you looked wrong, a small lopsided A. Aunt Saffron did what the church wouldn't. She went to the peddler's ruts where his wheels had pressed the road and read them like lines on a palm. The iron had been newly rubbed with fat, hog, not tallow, so it wouldn't complain. In the dust she found 4 beads of yellow pine sap and a hair that kinked in the middle like it had changed its mind and turned back. She ground the sap with ash and spit and smeared a cross on the hinge he'd fixed. "Hinge ain't for doors," she said. "It's for time." Harlan hated that sort of talk. It made the world bigger than him. He went through the smokehouse with a ledger under one arm, counting loud enough for God. Hams, 27. Shoulders, 9. Lydia. Assigned 5 days here, 3 in the kitchen, 2 at loom if needed. He underlined assigned twice. When he got to the barrel, his pen blotted a black tear. Pitch floated in the brine, black-brown eyes. He used the penknife to fish out a clot the size of a walnut. Embalmed in it was a splinter of wood worn smooth as if someone's thumb had passed over it for years. The splinter smelled like candle smoke. He put it in his pocket. He would lie about where it came from if anyone asked. Near sundown, cart bells chimed from the road, far off, smug. Joshua ran to the gate and saw the peddler standing between the corn rows, hat off, hair neat as a ledger line. "You folks short anything?" he asked pleasantly. "I take returns." Joshua didn't answer. He saw no horse. He saw no cart. He saw a bell hung in nothing. "How are you making bell music with no hands?" the boy asked. "Debts ring themselves," the man replied. Temperance stepped from the shade of the gatepost. "You brought me a ribbon once," she said. The peddler's smile was winter. "I bring folk the thing they ask for. It's never the thing they want." He tipped his head toward the pines. Running is a kind of prayer. Sometimes prayers get answered sideways. Aunt Saffron drew a nail from her sack. "You speak straight or you bleed crooked," she told him, palm open. The peddler's gaze slid to the little nail, blue-black from 100 fires. He measured her and found her dangerous. "There's a book," he said lightly, as if he were choosing a fabric. "Not yours. Not mine. It tallies what's owed when words get used wrong. Smokehouses are good banks. Pitch keeps a balance." He nodded toward the trees. "That place in there doesn't eat. It preserves." Temperance's lips whitened. "The girl." He shrugged with his eyelids. "Ledger says a name was promised, long ago. Ledger came due. The girl knew how to keep things from spoiling. That's rare. It made her relevant." "Take me instead," Temperance said, so fast the words fell. Aunt Saffron flinched. Harland made a raw throat noise that wasn't love. It was loss of property. The peddler cocked his head, entertained. "Substitutions require consent. Hers. And the thing under the pines doesn't bargain for meat," he murmured. "It bargains for time." "Then we'll go get her," Joshua snapped. "Then bring a clock," the peddler said, tipping an invisible hat as the bell rang itself twice. He was gone when the sound stopped. The corn didn't move. They brought a clock. Miss Lottie wound the big parlor clock tight, set it in a flour sack, and carried it in her arms like a child. "If time asks, we can say we paid cash," she joked without smiling. Aunt Saffron daubed pitch on everyone's wrists and temples. "So it knows your edges," she said. Joshua, light on his toes, wore the coil of line crossbody like a sash. Temperance slipped Harland's pen knife into her shoe. Harland carried nothing but his pistol and a thought he didn't trust. They entered the pines at the quiet hour before full dark. The air cooled the way air does when memory walks in the room. After 50 paces, the ground softened and gave a little like bread. The lantern light leaned away from them, warps in the oil glass that were not there in daylight. At the base of a black pine, resin had scabbed thick as candle wax. Thumbs had been pressed into it. The pattern wasn't random, it marked a curve. Joshua touched one print with a knuckle. It was cold and slick like an eye. They came to a place where the trees stood wider, leaving a shallow bowl. In its center sat a low stump tarred flat as a table, a notch cut tidy into the rim. "That's a cut for a tally stick," Aunt Saffron said. "They've been banking here since before any of our mouths got taught to say sir." Lottie set the clock on the stump and let its tick swallow the silence. The second hand made the smaller sound, a silver tooth-biting time. From the dark beyond the bowl came Lydia's humming, threaded with patience. Temperance's fingers climbed to her throat and found air. "Baby," she said softly, and the hum stumbled. A panel of darkness unglued itself from the far side of the clearing and unfolded into an opening. A door made of not dry, not wet, the kind of substance you get when you boil grief with pine and dare the result to harden. Joshua moved before anyone could stop him and drove a stake into the soft ground at the opening's lip. He tied the line to it, looped the other end around his own waist, and handed Harlan the slack. "If I yank, you pull," he said. "You aren't going," Temperance said. "I'm the smallest," he said, and that was a kind of truth no one could argue. Aunt Saffron spit in her palm and clapped it to his forehead. "No names in or out," she warned. "Something asks, you hum." He ducked into the knot door. The line went slack, taut, slack. The tick-tick-tick of Lottie's clock seemed to slow, seemed to speed, seemed to become a hum of its own. Temperance stared at the rope sliding over her husband's knuckles. Harlan breathed through his teeth. "Just a boy," he muttered, maybe to himself. From inside, Joshua's hum grew steadier, and under it lay a second sound, chalk on rough. That hooked A, trying to stand up. Harlan swallowed something that might have been an apology. The line jerked once, twice. Harlan and Lottie hauled, heels digging, Aunt Saffron chanting A Song Not Song. The opening pulsed like a throat refusing to swallow. Joshua burst back through, coughing resin, eyes rimmed black as if he'd powdered them with soot. He was smiling. In his fist, Lydia's red calico ribbon, tied in a perfect child's bow around a sliver of bark with chalk marks on it. 4 tall lines and a completed A. She finished it, he choked. She wrote her whole name. But she can't leave. Why? Temperance's voice came out in pieces. "She's keeping count," Joshua said, wiping pitch from his lips. He touched the clock. "Of us." Something had to be spoken, so it came from the person who'd carried its shadow longest. Temperance sat on the smokehouse step at dawn and said the thing she'd hidden under lace and piety. Miss Lottie sat with her knees touching, translating silence. "When I was 17, I named a child that wasn't mine," Temperance said, staring so hard at the yard she could have pushed a hole through it with will alone. "I said her name in a prayer I didn't understand, to a man I didn't know, because my sister died and God didn't take a message. I asked the pines to hush the world for an hour so I could hear my grief. The peddler told me names were currency. I gave him one to hold. He said I could redeem it when I was ready. I never went back for the claim." Miss Lottie breathed out through her nose. "You put Lydia's name in layaway with the dark," she said. Temperance flinched. "I didn't know." "I didn't know," she said, 2 different sentences. Harlan had come up behind them without steps. He stood with the penknife in his fist and the pitch splinter in his pocket and looked like he would shoot the sky if it blinked at him wrong. "We fix it," he said. "We pay him to bring her back." "You can't buy back time," Aunt Saffron said from the doorway, and the words made the clock inside the house skip. "You can only trade it for weight. The thing in the pines doesn't want blood. It wants hours stacked neat." "I'll give mine," Temperance said, too quick. All of them. That ain't mercy, Aunt Saffron snapped. That's pride in a pretty hat. This ain't about martyrdom. It's accounting. The household's surface cracked. The cook's youngest, Cinder, woke speaking Lydia's name backward. Graves the overseer found his boots nailed to the floor by Pitch. Tabber the mule leaned his big skull into the fence and wouldn't move even when they slap him, which is a way of saying the mule had more sense than his betters. In the brine barrel, the pitch splinter Harland pocketed reappeared without ever leaving his pocket. Ash filmed the surface with letters that were not letters and yet said, OWE. That evening a preacher came to insist that devils come in pairs and leave in threes if you make the right rhyme. He sweated a circle around the smokehouse and read from a book about men who threw swine to drown their sins in someone else's river. The circle turned slick. The preacher slipped and sat down in the salt. He went quiet, looking at his hand. Pine Pitch had lifted the lines in his palm and rearranged them into an A. Well, he whispered, and left without blessing anyone. Temperance went to the pines alone, because that's how proud women apologize. She walked until the quiet felt carved and knelt by the tally stump. Her shawl caught on a thorn. She didn't stop to free it. Listen, she said to the resin-sweet dark. You can keep me. Let the girl go. The pines did what pines do. They kept their counsel, but something passed near her that smelled like rain you don't get. Her breath clouded, then cleared. When she rose, Pitch had kissed the hem of her dress in 13 neat prints, small as a child's thumb. When she reached the yard, Miss Lottie took one look at the hem and said, They heard you. She did not say yes, and she did not say no. Night ran a ledger line through the center of glass land, separating what was called ordinary from what had always been true. All the bacon turned to rind. Milk soured in fresh-washed pails. Someone, no one would own it, heard scraping under the kitchen floor like a chalk nub riding in beams. Babies slept too deeply. Old men woke too lightly. The river rose without making sound. Graves walked the yard with a lantern and a cudgel until a shape took on his shadow and made it taller. He swung and hit air and heard his own name said back to him with the vowels wrong. In the morning his lantern lay in the dew, glass unbroken, flame gone out, handle sticky with pitch. He did not tell anyone about the handprint that had touched his throat and then left without squeezing. In the quarters, Aunt Saffron taught the humming to everyone. Not Lydia's tune, a companion line that braided under it and closed the gap where breath could get stolen. They hummed while cooking, mending, washing, lying down. When fatigue took them, the tune kept humming, one throat falling asleep, one waking up, the sound moving like a candle through rooms. Miss Lottie began to find showcase hidden in domestic places, inside the butter mold, on the underside of a spoon drawer, on the back of the looking glass where a face expects to see itself. Some were Lydia's child hand, some were taller, clean, efficient. Lottie kept them like pressed leaves. She's making a map, she said, but not of where she is, of where we keep pretending we aren't. Harland took to sitting up nights in the smokehouse with his pistol and the parlor clock on a meat hook, ticking above his head. He told himself he'd meet the peddler Mantaman. It's a small lie, that phrase. Men never meet as equals in places built for storing other creatures' bodies. On the second night, the pistol misfired with a sound like a cough. On the third, the clock stopped for one breath and then resumed as if it had considered mercy and decided against it. On the fourth night, Lydia's humming moved from the pines to the yard, clean as a seam. It circled the smokehouse once, twice, 3 times. On the third pass, Harland smelled rose and ashes. The pistol in his hand felt like a baby's weight. He set it down. Please, he said to a door. He was the kind of man who had never liked that word. The door answered by swelling in its frame. Wood grain raised in a pattern like writing. 4 lines and a hooked flourish. Lydia resolved from grease and oak, the A finishing itself without chalk. If you won't speak to me, Harland said to the wood, to the girl, to God, speak to the woman who made this tangle. He meant Temperance. The door didn't open, but somewhere in the house, a ribbon slid off a nail and fell soundlessly to the floor. "Banks have hours," Aunt Saffron said in the morning. "We go when the ledgers open." She told them to bring 3 things each: something owed, something given, and something broken that still worked. Miss Lottie brought a promise she hadn't kept, folded into a tattered letter, a thimble, bright from a girl's hair oil, and a china cup with a hairline that hadn't leaked yet. Joshua brought a stolen apple core, confession, a coil of new twine, gift, and a cracked marbles jar, still held marbles. Temperance took her wedding glove with the thumb worn thin, a page from the family Bible with a child's name not written and then written in pencil, and the ribbon. Harland brought the penknife he'd wanted to pass to a son, a payroll chit he'd never paid half proper, and the pitch splinter he kept pretending he hadn't touched. They walked into the pines at noon, when the air lay flat as a sheet. The tally stump waited, clean as if licked. Aunt Saffron set the cup down on the notch and the clock beside it, wound tight, ticking like a heartbeat that had learned manners. "You who count," she said into the resin shade, "we've brought weight." The pines listened. Sap bulged slow, tears that didn't fall. A seam opened in the ground, no wider than a prayer, and the smell of brine came up, meat salt and winter. Lydia's hum lifted in the distance, steady, patient, the way a child sings to stop from crying. A shape rose from the seam. It had a man's height and a tree's opinion of you. Its edges were smudged like charcoal. Where a face should be, resin gleamed, amber smooth, and inside that amber something dark drifted, hair fine as breath caught forever. The second set of prints from the smokehouse door made sense now. Toes too long, heel too soft, a hand learning to walk. The thing carried a tally stick. Into its notch were cut 4 deep grooves and a hook score. "Who are you?" Harland managed. "Holdfast," Aunt Saffron said before the thing could misname itself and make that the truth. "Old bank. Old binder. Keeper of promises folks shouldn't have made." The amber face inclined toward Temperance. The ribbon in her hand lifted without wind and tied itself around her wrist with a child's bow. Temperance sucked a breath. The resin dimmed, then warmed. If you've ever had grief recognize you, you know the feeling. Gentle as a knife that cleans itself. "Take me," Temperance whispered, the words truer now than when pride had pushed them. The amber dark rippled. "Consent," Aunt Saffron murmured, warning. "It must be done without lying." "I owe," Temperance said. "I named what wasn't mine to name." The resin face turned and listened to Lydia's hum. The hum didn't falter. It braided with Aunt Saffron's undersong and made a third harmony, Lottie's voice, shaky but brave. Joshua grabbed the line on his shoulder like courage has a rope. The bank wants equal and opposite. That's a law. This one wanted the thing Lydia had that none of the rest did. Not hands. Not hours. She could make time last. She was keeping our winter, Lottie whispered, realizing. She was doing a woman's magic with meat and salt. The pines wanted that skill. "So teach me," Temperance said to the resin face. "Take my hands to do her keeping. Give her back her walking." The amber dark stirred like something reconsidering. It lifted the tally stick. One groove filled with light and smoothed itself away. "It ain't a no," Aunt Saffron breathed. "But it ain't yet a yes. You can't open a bank vault with a hymn alone. You need combination and witness." Aunt Saffron said the last number was under the house. Miss Lottie made the kind of face women make when they know they're about to break 2 rules and set a third on fire. She led them to the crawl space, skirts hitched, jaw set. Under the kitchen, among bottles lost to mice and buttons traded by ghosts, someone had scratched letters into the beam years ago. T, R, U, S, T. The T's were long as fences. The S was crooked like a river bluff. Lottie had done it the year Temperance married Harland. She'd scratched it hard enough to split her nail to the quick. She touched the old word now, and pitch beaded on it like sweat. "It's asking for more witnesses," she said, her mouth full of splinters. So they gathered the people who had not been asked for truth when the glasses told theirs. The quarters came, Dinah with her braid coiled high, old Amos who remembered the flood that had moved the cemetery without asking the families, Cinder carrying a rag doll with a button eye that wobbled like doubt. Graves came too, sour and ashamed and mad about both. The preacher did not come. His hand still bore the A, and he said he had to pray about it, which is how some men apologized to a wall. At sunset they went back to the pines with the clock, the cup, the rope. The opening yawned, resin breath smooth. "This time we all go in," Aunt Saffron said. "But we go in holding." They tied themselves with the rope, hand to waist, waist to hand, so no one could be subtracted without the others feeling the tug. Harlan tried to untie his knot twice when no one looked. Lottie rapped his knuckles the way a good teacher corrects a child. Inside the knot door, time stacked wrong. Footsteps echoed before they fell. The lantern's fringe light stitched from ahead and behind at once. Lydia's hum became everywhere. Every tree was the smokehouse wall, every root a hook. Messages glowed in the pitch, not words, not hours, but meanings. Keep. Oh. Hold. Give. Aunt Saffron touched the letters and they smoked without heat. "We've been living under this grammar all our lives," she said softly. The rope tightened. Someone, them, not them, had taken up slack. Joshua squeezed Temperance's hand. "Don't say your name," he hissed. A voice like a well-mouthed whispered Temperance's childhood nickname in her left ear anyway. She shook. Lottie hummed louder, and others caught it until the hum was a handrail. They reached a room that wasn't. In it stood the tally stump, the parlor clock ticking on it as if walls had followed them, and a small figure leaned over the stump with a chalk nub in her fist. Lydia. Hair frizzed with resin, bare feet dark to the ankle where pitch had kissed and hardened, eyes bright, alive, distant the way water at dusk is alive and distant. She had written Lydia again, careful, and the A was the cleanest letter you ever saw. She looked up when Temperance said baby, and her mouth made the shape of a smile that forgot what it was halfway. "Home." Temperance begged. Lydia shook her head, tapped the tally stick. "Keeping," she whispered, voice like paper. She tapped the clock. "Due." She tapped the rope, then Aunt Saffron's pitch-daubed brow. "Trade." A shape unpeeled from the resin shadow, the peddler, hat in hand, not quite touching the ground. "Substitutions make books messy," he said with a grin you could fold laundry on. "But sometimes messy is profit." "Name the price," Harlan snapped. "I didn't bring the ledger," the man said, amused. "The tree keeps it." He nodded at Temperance's ribbon, tied as if by a child who needed to hurry. "You tied the first bow. Tie the last one right." Temperance stepped to Lydia. Hands shook. Voices hummed. Aunt Saffron counted in a language that remembers drums. Temperance took the ribbon and tied it around the tally stick where the notch met wood. It held. Resin hissed. The parlor clock skipped a beat and caught itself. A second groove on the stick filled with light and vanished. Lydia swayed. "Hungry," she said, almost herself. "Salt," Lottie said, and poured a pinch into Lydia's palm. The girl licked it, eyes closing, and for one heartbeat the room that wasn't tea looked like a kitchen you could grow old in. The bank wanted one more line cleared. Aunt Saffron knew because the hair on her arms lay down as if some invisible hand had smoothed it. "Confession," she said aloud, and all of them knew and wished they didn't. Harland looked at his shoes. Temperance looked at Harland. Lydia looked at the rope. "I misspoke a vow," Temperance started. "Not you," Aunt Saffron said gently. She turned to Harland, who had a way of standing like a door you couldn't open without breaking. "Ledger got your ink all over it, Master Glass." He tried an older trick. "I provided. I kept order. I." "Name what you took," Aunt Saffron said, and the resin pressed in. The peddler leaned against nothing and watched, delighted by arithmetic that pinched. Harland found the edges of his mouth with his teeth. I took time, he said grudgingly, from every back on this land. I took sleep. I took the good part of meat and left the rind. I took my wife's grief and gave it a job. I took a child's name and put it in a book that wasn't ours. Say her name right, Lottie whispered. Lydia, he said, and it hurt him in a place bullets can't get to. The resin face, Holdfast itself, tipped, listening. The clock on the stump dared the room to breathe wrong. The tally stick drank the sound. Third groove, light, then gone. Lydia blinked slow like waking from a fever. She looked at Temperance's hands, at Lottie's thimble bright in a pocket, at Joshua's rope-burn knuckles. Cold, she whispered. Aunt Saffron touched the pitch on Lydia's ankle. You be cold a little longer, baby. Winter's when meat keeps. She looked at Temperance. Last trade is yours, she said. You offer what you clutched. Temperance reached into her bodice and brought out the family Bible page with the faint penciled name. Her sister's dead child, no hours, all wait. She held the page up between herself and the resin face. I write her in the book today, Temperance said, voice shaking enough to be true. I bring her to the table when we say names. I sing her birthday when the river blooms. No more hush. I don't barter with the pine again. Holdfast made a sound like sap cooling. The page browned at the edges as if a kiss had singed it. Fourth groove, light, then air. The tally stick went smooth. The ribbon untied itself and laid across Lydia's palm like a vein. The knot room softened, edges going trustworthy. Home, Lydia said again, and her voice this time was the right size. Leaving a place like that isn't walking. It's untying. They came back along the rope, hands warm, breath human, pitch drying to dust at their wrists. The parlor clock thunked on the stump and kept ticking. At the opening's lip, the world made a small correcting noise and settled. They stepped into afternoon. The yard had not moved. The sky had. Miss Lottie cried so silently her face didn't know the difference between rain and relief. Lydia's feet touched dirt and did not sink. The resin on her ankles cracked with soft sounds like letters being erased from a slate. Tabber the mule lifted his head and blew a long judgment through his nose. The quarters stood in their doorways and didn't dare clap because joy makes bargains nervous. Harland reached for Lydia and stopped himself, not out of decency but because the ribbon in her hand lay across his wrist as if measuring. He said, "I," and had no second word. Temperance stepped between them and bent to Lydia's height. "Baby," she whispered, "can I comb your hair?" Lydia's chin moved a fraction. That was consent. In the kitchen, Temperance oiled a wooden comb and drew it through pitch and curl until it moved like water where it had been hard like math. Every fourth pull, Temperance's hand shook. Every fifth, Lydia hummed. They fed her right, broth with rice, salt on the tongue, then bread torn small with fingers Lottie had washed in brine. Aunt Saffron dabbed the last of the pitch kisses from Lydia's ankles with vinegar. "Don't make promises," she told everyone who could hear. "Make plans." The peddler's bell rang once from the road. They went to the gate. He stood there with no cardigan, hat neat, shirt clean, the river in his eyes high and pleased. "Good accounting," he said. "Few manage." "Take your ledgers to hell," Harlan said, gentle as a curse that finally fit. "Oh, I work every district," the peddler smiled. "Schedules are full." He tipped his not hat at Lydia. "Keepers are rare, little one. Don't waste the talent." Lydia stared at him with unruined eyes and said nothing. "You cannot collect silence if it doesn't belong to you." He vanished the way fair weather does. Somewhere deep, something old adjusted at some. Unmaking took longer than making, as is right. They dismantled the smokehouse brick by greased brick, washing each and lye until the water ran clean. They dug down to where the packed earth went from brown to tar bleak and found, elbow deep, a rusted iron ring no one had known was there, the kind sailors bolt to docks, the kind you fasten promises to. It tugged at them like a tide. They pried it up with pry bars and a psalm Aunt Saffron half remembered and rolled it onto a door laid flat for a sled. Tabber, sensible, contrary, agreed to haul it only when Lydia laid her small hand to his brow. At the river, the iron ring twitched against the water as if hounds waded below. Let it sink or send it down river? Lottie asked. Float it, Aunt Saffron said. Give it a chance to choose. They lashed it to 2 hickory poles and pushed. The ring drifted sideways, then straight, then tipped with a clean, shock sound, and went down. Bubbles rose big as coins and touched Lydia's calves with cold kisses. She didn't flinch. That night, no humming came from the pines. The yard felt like honest sweat at dusk. The parlor clock ticked at a mortal pace. In the brine barrel, only brine. The hooks shone, empty, like they had remembered shame. Temperance wrote a name in the Bible in ink, slow, careful, letters even, hands steady. Lottie said grace over nothing in particular and everything all at once. Aunt Saffron slept for 1 hour with her mouth relaxed and woke to find her beer bottle had finally died the right kind of dead. What of Harland? Some men grow tender when the universe hands them a lesson. He wanted to. You could see wanting live and die behind his eyes 3 times a day. He paid wages late twice and then on time 4 months running. He stopped saying mine about things that had breath. He still wore pride like a shirt he didn't know how to take off alone. Change is not a tale. It's a ledger too, with columns you balance until you don't. What of Lydia? She kept to the kitchen's good light. She salted meat and sang to it with a private mouth, and winter didn't rot anything that winter. She walked to the Smokehouse foundation, an honest rectangle of dirt now, and drew letters in the dust with her toe, over and over, not for her name anymore, but for the word Aunt Saffron had scratched under the house years ago. The letter that starts apology. The letter that starts after. She grew an inch. She smiled sideways sometimes. She tied her own ribbon. The pines remained, because places outlast the bargains they held. Hunters say the grove carries a cool even in August. Rivermen say their oars drag once when they pass that bend as if they've rowed over a drowned bell. Children born after the war dare each other to count the trees, and they always come back 1 number short. The iron ring never washed up. The preacher left a year later for Natchez and refused to take his hand off that A with lie or prayer. Lydia grew from girl to girl on their edge. When the river flooded 2 springs later, she hauled a child by the shirt collar through water that tried to make him a ledger entry. When a peddler came with bells too clean, she pointed to the road and the mule's ears went flat and he went. When Aunt Saffron's breath began to cost her, Lydia pressed pitch-smelling cloths to her chest and counted with her, deep and even, and the old woman went out sweet, not banked. People will tell you Lydia vanished when she was 15. They will say she walked into fog and found the seam and chose it. That's not entirely wrong. The day she left, she packed salt, bread, ribbon, a comb, and the page Temperance had written in the Bible, copied by Miss Lottie's exacting hand so the original could stay and the confession go. She kissed Temperance's cheek like you kiss a shard that still cuts and doesn't mean to. She bumped her shoulder against Joshua's on purpose. She whistled once to Tabber and the mule flicked an ear like blessing. At the grove's edge she turned. I keep what keeps, she said. I don't spoil. She walked into country not on any map, the kind you enter when you pay the right debt the right way. Some say she headed upriver and worked in Memphis kitchens, salting hams that wouldn't sour during siege. Some say she stood with a woman named Charity and ferried breathless boys through night reeds to safer ground. Some say she sits sometimes on a stump in a pine place with no smokehouse now, humming a hum that makes meat keep and promises keep honest. Harland died later than he should have and earlier than he expected, which is most of us. Temperance outlived him and tended graves with a trowel and bare hands, cutting roots that tried to tangle names. Miss Lottie taught reading to anybody who would sit long enough to be taught, chalking the straightest you ever saw and telling children to finish what they start but never to start what they ain't willing to finish. Joshua grew into a man with a runner's legs and a peacekeeper's temper. He carried rope and bread wherever he went and never tied a knot he couldn't untie. As for the peddler, he comes through now and then, all over this world, with his hands empty and his bell full. If you hear him, shut your door. If you must speak to him, count how many things you name. Keep your own ledger. Name your own dead. Tie your own boughs. What is known as this? A smokehouse burned from the inside on a hot night when the river smelled like iron and thunder. A girl's footprints and a second set of something walking stopped at a wall. No body. No bones. A ribbon. A bead of pitch with a hair sealed in it like a story that doesn't wish to be told and doesn't plan to be forgotten. A family tore down a building and unburied a ring and chose to float it. A mule refused water for one night and then drank. A hush lifted. But listen close, and you'll still hear a hum when the air lies heavy. A child's tune, steady as salt, patient as winter. If you hear it, don't go to the door. Go to your ledger. Look at the words you've written in other people's ink. Rub them out. Write your own name true. Teach the youngest in your house to tie boughs carefully and unbar doors gently. Do you think Lydia crossed over to the place that preserves what we try to forget? Or do you think she's walking still, counting hours for people who never got to spend theirs? Did we tell all of it here, or did we leave one letter unfinished, waiting for your eye to see the curve? Tell me what you believe in the comments. If this story kept you, share it with the one person who double-checks locks before bed. Subscribe to Tales Never Told. Ring that bell so you don't miss the next voice pulling at the dark. And if you're listening on a long drive, take a breath, check your mirrors, and don't follow bells you can't see. These stories need keeping. These voices need room. I'll see you in the next one.